Hello, friends. We survived another work week. Welcome to CANNAfact Friday Live. So I have to say, I love our new opening music. I was dancing a little bit here. It was like, that's some good energy that we need on a Friday. Do you like it, David?
I do. And it's a big change from our music last week, which was a little somber. So we decided to change it up a little bit. I was breakdancing here on my living room floor prior to coming in. So, whew, I might be a little sweaty.
Yeah,
I'm excited.
wipe off that sweat. So yeah, this is episode 4, CANNAfact Friday Live. Welcome everyone who's joining us. If this is your first time, I'll tell you what we're doing here. So every week on Friday, we share a stat and we provide some context about what it might mean, stats related to cannabis consumer behavior. And of course, we have some fantastic experts to also help us and weigh in on what we're talking about. I'm Adriana Humans. I'm the VP of Strategy at ISA, a consumer insights firm based in Los Angeles. And I'm joined by my co-host, David Palaschuk, the best-selling author of the first book on cannabis branding called Branding Bud, the Commercialization of Cannabis.
Hi, Adriana. Thanks for introducing me and thanks for being my co-host. This is our, as you said, our 4th episode, and we're having lots of fun doing it. At least I am. I hope the audience is as well. This is basically where we get together on a Friday and we select a fact during the week, which has caught our interest. And we try to ground that fact and contextualize it into some meaningful information. And what we do is we bring an expert on to our show to talk through some of these data points and try to really, again, contextualize, better understand, and ground what's happening in the industry that we work and that we live in. So I'm excited about that. Most important, too, we have the opportunity for the guests that are listening to ask questions and participate as well. So please feel free
And I
to...
see we just had a comment come in that says, thank you for sharing a bit of context for the newcomers. You're welcome. So feel free to drop some messages or questions for us.
Right on. And again, this is our 4th episode, so if anybody has any questions or any things they'd like us to cover, just ask. That's what we're here for. So most importantly, please leave your comments and or questions, and we'll get to them during the course of the conversation or toward the end of the conversation. I am very excited. I think we've got a great guest today. We are moving into a slightly different area, which is concentrates today. We definitely have the person to chat about that. You want to talk a little bit more about that, Adriana?
Yeah, let's do it. So really quick, before we kick it off, I just have a question for you, David. Do you know what BDE stands for? Have you heard that acronym before?
BDE, of course. It's big data energy. And look,
Exactly.
neck tattoo. I know what BDE is.
Exactly.
Big data energy.
Yeah, so
that's what we're bringing every week.
Exactly. We're doing something a little different this week. So typically we've been sharing some survey data. This time we're going to share some big data from millions of online conversations. So yeah, let's get into it.
Right on. We have a comment.
A little bit of a controversy with that one already, but that's good. Controversy is good, right? Okay, so let's jump in. So first of all, big, giant, huge shout out to my colleague, Anthony Michael, who is a senior strategist at Material. He went in, dug out, analyzed 4.4 million real conversations over a 1-year period from Q4 2019 to Q4 2020, which we all know that was an extremely eventful year. And this comes from real conversations on forums, blogs, social media, Reddit, wide variety of sources. So looking at this graph, we just pulled out some keywords, and these are keywords that are form factors or product types of different forms of concentrates. And we're going to talk to Claudio. I'm American, so I say it with a D. Claudio Miranda, who's the CEO and founder of Guild Enterprises, and he knows a lot about concentrates, as you can imagine.
Right. So that said, let me formally introduce him and we'll bring him up and then we'll start chatting a little bit. But Claudio Miranda is the founder and CEO of Guild Enterprises, which makes a number of different form factors and products. And I know them best as Guild Extracts, which is really one of the best extraction companies and extract brands in all of California. I've known them for quite some time, and I've been pleased to sample their products over the course of time as well. And Claudio Miranda is the CEO and co-founder of the company. Welcome, Claudio.
Hey guys, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I should throw out that Claudio's background is really not only in cannabis, but many years in consumer product goods and marketing, brand development, business development, branding, and Claudio has really taken those talents and focused those talents on Guild Enterprises and the brand in California. So again, welcome for joining us.
Thanks so much, guys.
Right on. Oh, sorry. One other thing too. Was named one of the 100 most influential people by High Times magazine as well, and I just want to throw that out as well. That's important. So let's shall we jump in and just talk about the chart we had up a little bit a moment ago? And actually before we start getting into the details here, Claudio, I know that. Just to level set here, I think it would be really great to sort of go through some of the definitions here of certain resin or shatter or rosin or wax or distillate. Would you mind just a quick high level overview of those so we're level setting and everybody?
Yeah, I think some of our viewers might not be familiar with all of these terms.
Right.
Yep. Sure. Happy to talk about that. Well, yeah, look, I think the form factors, as you put it, and the different names that various concentrates have can be a little confusing because in some cases, the words are used kind of more generally, like in the sense of like wax. Sometimes people use wax a little bit more universally to talk about different types of concentrates. In some cases, it could be referred to something more specific. I think traditionally the name that a concentrate would get when you look at things like shatter and batter and sauce and butter, a lot of times that would reflect the consistency and texture of the product. So shatter would be called shatter because it's like glass that if you kind of break it, it shatters like glass. And sauce looks more saucy, and butter looks kind of a little bit more like a brick of butter. And so oftentimes it was just kind of naming it as you see it in terms of the texture. But then there's also things like distillate versus other types of concentrates. The ones that I just went through typically tend to be hydrocarbon-based concentrates, also known as BHO, butane hash oil. Whereas there's other ways of making extracts using ethanol, alcohol, CO2. And so distillate, for example, can be said as opposed to other ways of making extracts. And so there's solvent and solventless. So there's a lot of words that are involved in describing concentrates that can either denote the method used to make extracts, or the actual form factor that the consumer sees, and again points a little bit more to the consistency of it. So there's a lot to kind of unpack there, but that's kind of a broad brushstroke.
Super awesome. Helpful, and the way you put it makes so much sense. Like looking at the consistency, you can tell what the name might be.
Absolutely. and so I know we're going to dive into these things. We're going to take a look at really a peak here, if you will, in Q3. But Adriana, do you want to talk through this slide a little bit and set it up?
Yeah. I wanted to just sort of point out a couple of little pieces here. And there's really, we could talk about this all day. It's so rich. But what I wanted to kind of maybe dive into, if you're willing, is talking about what's happening here in Q3 of 2020. There seems to be a lot of movement here. And I'd like to hear from the two of you if you see maybe some cultural influences, event influences, holiday influences. What might be happening at this time that would maybe spark a little movement in terms of online conversations?
There's a few things that come to mind on my end. I think probably the most common attributor there that we can really think about is 710, right? That's really at the beginning of Q3. We know that 710 is like the 420 for concentrates. It's a very popular kind of holiday, so to speak, or event where you see a lot of activity within the cannabis industry on the retail side, from various parties and whatnot. So it kind of makes sense that at 710, when concentrates are in the spotlight, that you would see a lot of activity, not just kind of conversations, online chatter, but you see a lot of activity on the retail level with sales. It's kind of one of the biggest sale days. And of course, it's not just 710. Usually it's surrounding 710. Obviously, all the main events are on the date itself, July 10th. Which, by the way, 710 is, for those that don't know, it's oil kind of spelled upside down. So it has kind of a funny little history with that. But yeah, so it's not just kind of on 710, but I know in the case of dispensaries, there's usually events that like 420 that either lead up to it, or 710 on a Friday. That whole weekend, you can see a lot of activity around it. So that's kind of one common thing where kind of concentrates again are in the spotlight for that period of time. A couple other things that kind of come to mind there is I know that like Puffco, for example, was about to release their Puffco Peak Pro. I think that came out in October. So maybe a lot of conversation leading up to that. I think they were leaking some of that. There's a lot of chatter there that one can maybe think about there that maybe could have contributed to that a little bit. Also, it's interesting when we get into live resin. I know that live rosin, going back to kind of different names, right? Like, what's the difference between live resin and live rosin? But I'd be curious to see that as you're picking up these conversations, how many of them might be getting confused between people talking about live resin versus live rosin, using some of those words interchangeably, or maybe being confused about the differences. But live rosin started to get a lot of press around that time. I believe High Times did a big article on it toward the end of Q3, where they really featured live rosin as kind of the one of the great new kind of concentrates to be talking about. Not that it was really new, but it was getting a lot of publicity and traction around that time, and continues to be center stage to this day. So happy to talk about that separately.
We just got a comment from Matthew saying purity, which I'm assuming he's saying like this is why it earned that reputation and got the spotlight that you just mentioned. I also saw an article in Rolling Stone about it too. So definitely a lot of movement in the media front. I think it would be amazing for a future show to have Anthony come on and share with us how he does some of his mad scientist magic, and we can unpack some of these things. But yeah, thank you for providing that context. It's super helpful to understand what sparks this movement.
Yeah, what sparks the activity. Would you mind just touching upon the difference between live resin and live rosin?
Sure. Yep. So the lives, when you think about like anything like live resin, at least originally the idea is that it was made from fresh frozen plant material, right? As opposed to material that's cured, right? So most forms of concentrates, at least historically, you're harvesting the flower and you're going through the normal kind of process of curing, drying the flower, and then after that you go through the process. And when live resin kind of came on the scene, you were really trying to capture the essence of the flower as it would exist on the plant. And so as you're harvesting it, you're not going through the typical kind of drying and curing process. You're flash freezing it and you're preserving it. And the reason you're doing that is to really preserve the terpene profile and the flavonoids, to really get that kind of bright expression that you can really, that again, as you smell cannabis on the flower, and if you're ever dealing with a really fresh product, that's where those terpenes are really popping. So the idea is, how do we preserve that terpene profile? And at the end of the day, the full spectrum profile, when you're thinking about terpenes, flavonoids, cannabinoids, a lot of extraction methods tend to degrade a lot of those compounds as it goes through the extraction process. So live resin, among other types of extraction methods, is very effective way of trying to preserve that full spectrum complex of compounds that you find in the plant, all the way through the end product, so that consumer is having kind of the richest sensory experience at the end of that. So that's live resin. And typically what we find in the marketplace with live resin is that it's made through hydrocarbon-based extraction, again, what's commonly known as BHO. So that's using solvents, hydrocarbon solvents, as a way to extract the cannabis. Whereas live rosin, on the other hand, is solventless. So you're not using solvent in the extraction process, and not to get like too technical, but you're basically using heat and pressure and other methods of being able to go through that same process, not using a solvent. And for a lot of the purists out there, rosin, and I'll be the first to admit, rosin is, I think, as a commentator said, is the purest form of concentrate that you can get, that is the least manipulated, the least adulterated. Again, you're not using solvents that could detract from the cannabinoid expression or the terpene expression. With live rosin, I think you're getting that purest essence of the cannabis flower in the form of a concentrate. And for those that are purists in the sense of like a naturalist, right? Or someone maybe leans toward organic type products, not having solvents. If you think about things like butane and propane and hexane, these are, again, hydrocarbon solvents. At Guild Extracts, as well as other concentrate companies, we purge those solvents out. So at the end of the day, you're never smoking that in the end product. But it's still, for some companies, there is residual solvents in the end product. Back in the day, you'd have a lot of those residual solvents. So for someone that really wants to be a purist and not have any of that in their end product, and the cleanest product, solventless is really the way to go. And there's lots of different types of solventless products, but a rosin is really become the most popular. And then live rosin is one that's made with that live kind of fresh frozen that I referred to.
Wow.
I'm so glad you brought up that piece about the sensory experience. And that really ties in with this quote that came from a real online conversation. That seems to be a theme as people are talking about the smell and the taste, and the process of making it is something that they respect and admire. So I'm just going to read you this one quote that got pulled out from the subject was favorite kind of dabs. Somebody wrote, live resins for sure, can't beat the smell and taste of them. I love rosins too, just for the making process, but the price and end product just aren't up to par with live resin yet. So one example of thousands and thousands and thousands of conversations that we pulled out.
Yep, I would agree with that.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you for also going through some of those definitions. Well, I've been in the industry now for 12 years, and it seems like, definitions change and words are interchangeable, and you never know if somebody has a typo with an E or an O. Is it resin or rosin? There's there's just lots to sort of keep track of and make sure you have right over time.
Well, yeah, and one thing I'll add to that, so live resin in particular has been used a little bit, the meaning, not the meaning of it, but how it's used to denote a certain concentrate has been stretched a bit. You find that a lot in cartridges, for example, that someone will call something like a live resin cartridge. But what we found is that some brands, blend it with like distillate, for example, or there's other cutting agents in there. So the idea is that ultimately with a live resin, you would want this purity that we're referring to, whether it's live rosin or live resin. But then I think we can agree, if you're formulating it with other ingredients, so to speak, like distillate or other cutting agents, then are you really getting a live resin product at the end of the day? And if the end goal is to have that experience, that sensory experience, I love to equate it to like wine, where you're getting the aromatics, you're getting that flavor. You can imagine if you try to dilute wine or formulate it in some way where you're adding ingredients, wine purists would really, would not be happy with that outcome. And by the same token, your hardcore dabbers and concentrate enthusiasts are going to have that same perspective. And so live resin sometimes is applied to products that one can argue shouldn't bear the name.
And I'm so glad that you brought up wine, because we're going to get into a little bit of a parallel with that in a minute when we talk about appellation designations.
Yeah. Claudio, you touched upon something, and I guess we'll get into it in a minute. familiarity and preference. But as you talk through this, it's pretty complicated and pretty complex, as these levels of extraction take place, right? And create different products out of them, different form factors, like you said, shatter is butter and batter and so on and so forth. How you also mentioned dabbers too. How deep is that world, if you will, within the cannabis industry? And I ask that because, as I said, we'll get to something in a moment about familiarity and difference. But if you're not familiar with these things, or if you're a little confused by the different form factors, it's really hard to get your head around what exactly am I purchasing, what am I going to the store for, what are the effects of one versus another. So how rabbit holed, for lack of a better way, are extracts in the cannabis space, or are they something that the masses will consume over time?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think what's interesting is that historically, the dabber, as we call them, right, the concentrate enthusiast, as a kind of another way of saying it, they have tended to be the kind of the folks that geek out the most when it comes to cannabis. I would say that if there's a culture of connoisseurship around cannabis, you'll find it most with, exactly. You'll find that most within the dabber community. Now, obviously with flower, it's the same thing, right? People can geek out to no end on just on flower, and there's your flower purists. But at least in our experience, and Guild Extracts was kind of born out of this cultural experience, that when we first came to market commercially in 2015 in California, and we were going to a lot of the events like the High Times Cannabis Cups and HempCon and Emerald Cup, the type of customers or consumers that we would see coming to our booths and engaging with us, and we call them the backpack dabber, because they would have their backpacks on, and inside their backpack would be their dab rigs and all sorts of other accessories that go with the ritual of consuming concentrates. And if you ever sit down with these folks, they're enthusiasts, right? They really, really geek out. They love their concentrates. And there is a very deep rabbit hole there, definitely, especially now that you've seen all these different types of concentrates in the market, like we said, with live rosin and all the different form factors and all the different consistencies. It just goes on and on and on. And to me, it really, you alluded to, Adriana, that we'll be getting in kind of some wine parallels. To me, it's very, very parallel to wine. I'm personally a wine connoisseur. I've been a wine connoisseur and collector for most of my life. And you can just geek to no end. There's no end point. No matter how much you think you know, there's a level deeper. And as you go closer and closer to like the sommelier level knowledge of wine, I think with cannabis and with concentrates in particular, there's a lot of parallels there. And we're seeing now people getting like a sommelier, like a Gangier type of certificate or designation. We're going to see that happening increasingly in the field of concentrates. And you have that again with flower. But I think why concentrates became, I think, such a connoisseur item. Well, one thing is because of the potency. Like, let's not leave that aside, right? Your typical cannabis flower, let's say 20, 30%. Now we're seeing it pushing within the 30, 35 and more percent THC content. With concentrates, you're getting, 2-3 times that, right? We can go as high as the 90s. In the case of Guild Extracts, we kind of innovated and brought to market THCA crystalline as 99.99% pure. And that also has this kind of geek factor that goes with that, is that we found in the earlier days of cannabis, it was kind of a race to the top. Like, can you find the most potent concentrate? And that, for people that really want to lean on the recreation cannabis consumption, was exciting. Like, great. Like, now I have flower that, back in the day, we would smoke flower Mexican or something that would be 5% potency. And then it went to 10%, 15, and now again, it's pushing 35, 40% potency. So with concentrates, you start to see 70, 80, 90, and now we're at 99%. So that cult of potency, if I can kind of call it that, became a big part of the undercurrent, I think, of that dabber culture. And one last thing I'll say, and kind of creating a parallel with wine, is that we saw that in wine history as well. People started to gravitate more toward your high alcohol type of Cabernets, where you would get cabs that would be 16% alcohol. But then the pendulum swung in the industry, where now connoisseurs want to get a wine that's maybe 12%, 13% alcohol. Why? Because you get more aromatic expression there, you get more flavors. And I think with concentrates, we're seeing something similar there too, that it's not just about potency, that if you want to optimize for potency, then again, like Guild Extracts brought you THCA crystalline as the most potent thing you can do. But as you swing the pendulum down to less potent, you start to bring out other qualities in the concentrate, like more higher terpene expression, more flavonoids, and you start to get more of the nuance of the end of the concentrate, of the flower that it's derived from, in the same way that you would with a low alcohol wine. You get more nuance and sensory experience around the grape of which the wine was derived from. So just a kind of interesting way of thinking about that.
I love that that analogy and that comparison.
So does our viewer Linda. Thanks for the comment, Linda. She said, "Love the wine comparison."
So I just a quick question here. So do you see over time? I mean, right now, when a typical cannabis consumer walks into an adult use store, the first question is, what's the level of THC typically? Do you see that conversation changing to what are the terp profiles? What are the levels of, myrcene or limonene or any other, terp to bring on effects? Do you think the conversation will change in that direction over time?
Definitely. And here again, I think it's just like any consumer product. We've been kind of leaning on wine, so maybe we'll kind of stick with that as an example. Look, there's a huge percentage of consumers that when they go buy wine, they're just like, I want Merlot, I want Cabernet, I want something fruity. And then the language they use and the preferences they have are pretty simple and straightforward, right? And there's a lot of wines that can service that. And you can see that with like beer, with tea, with a lot of products that have a connoisseur end of the spectrum, again, beer, tea, wine, or one that's a little bit more generalized that just, hey, I just want Cabernet that is fruity, right? So I think with cannabis, we're going to see the same thing, right? So that conversation has been happening for a long time, but it's a very small percentage of people that are having that conversation for starters, right? I'm sure if you go to the average dispensary and you were to kind of sit there and observe the conversations happen at point of sale, it's basically like, well, what's going to get me the highest, or what's going to get me the not the highest, right? Macro dosing versus micro dosing. That is a newer trend that we've started to see. It's been for a little while now, but we see it increasingly, whereas previously everything was macro, macro, macro. Like, I want the most potent chocolate bar, I want the most potent concentrate. Now we're seeing microdosing as you get a new segments of consumer demographics come into the market that want a more functional high, that want something that's not going to just obliterate them and leave them on the couch, right? So so that's kind of, those are two ends of the spectrum, is micro versus macro. And then there's also people that want to get into more of that nuance. And that's going back to the question about concentrates. You find a lot of that more nuanced conversation happening around concentrates. Whereas if you imagine, and obviously you're not going to see it in certain categories, right? You're not going to find it as much as people going in and talking about topicals, or maybe going in and talking about edibles, right? Now, there is a conversation to be had there, but there's different use cases, in other words, I think will lend themselves to a more nuanced connoisseurship conversation, where things like the terpene profiles will be more relevant, whereas certain types of products, it's just simply not relevant. And you find with a lot of the manufacturer infused products, it's not as relevant because those use cases don't lend themselves to those types of conversations. We're getting in concentrates and in flowers. You're going to increasingly see that get more and more nuance, and a culture of connoisseurship develop around it.
Super interesting. And while we're on the topic of preferences, let's jump to the next slide so that we can talk a little bit about familiarity and preference here. So we're going back now to survey data. We surveyed cannabis consumers across the United States, and we asked them which types of concentrates they're familiar with and which type that they prefer. You can see there's quite a variety here of different choice options. And so you see that, right, it kind of makes sense that familiarity drives the preference. You have to first learn about a product, then you have to try it, and then you develop your preferences, like we were just talking about with, figuring out as a consumer, what do I care about? Do I care about the flavor? Do I care about the potency? Do I care about how it's made? So all these things, play together. But you see sometimes that there's the familiarity is high for one category, but it doesn't quite match up in the preference category. So maybe we can dive into a little bit, get some context here about preferences and how, what sort of drives more widespread adoption for certain form factors versus others. Do you see a pattern here with the way consumers are adopting other forms of products, or even a comparison to wine like you just made?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting because you see like hash, for example, that's like, very, very popular in terms of preference and familiarity. But
Yep.
again, hash has been sometimes used as a little bit of a broad statement, right? Like, for example, we talked about butane hash oil, right? BHO, which is hydrocarbon-based concentrates, which live resin and sauce and batter and those products fall under, but that's hash, right? It's butane hash oil. So in some ways, I wonder if the data you guys are picking up, it's where people are using the word hash. You can use it in a very specific sense of a specific type of concentrate made a very specific way. But hash has also historically had a broader kind of meaning that just speaks to any concentrate, right? Like, I want to smoke hash, right? I'm a hash maker. So like at Guild Extracts, we could argue, hey, we're hash makers, right? And we use solvents to make our hash, right? So that's one thing to bear in mind, why I think hash is the most popular, because it also has the broadest meaning and can be used in a lot of
history.
Right. Exactly. So that's one kind of thing to point out there. At the top, for example, with shatter and live resin, there's also there is that history, right? So shatter came on the market earlier than live resin, right? I believe shatter became, if my memory serves me well, became first kind of commercially available, I think, in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, is at least when we first started seeing it in the market. I remember going up to Canada, up in Vancouver at that time. There's a lot of product moving around Canada and the US area in the late 90s, early 2000s, and shatter kind of started to come into being at that point. Whereas live resin, I remember that almost like a decade later, we saw the innovation of live resin. And here again, people can argue, oh, I was smoking live resin, 20 years ago. Well, sure. We're not talking about when someone might have made it in their house or had their experience with it. I'm talking about more when it became culturally and commercially popular. And shatter was in the early 2000s. And then thereafter, whereas live resin was really more like a decade later. I think like 2012, 2013, we started to see that. So this kind of speaks to the familiarity, right? More people are familiar with shatter because it's been around a lot longer, right? And live resin is a little bit more, recent, right? Now you flip that to preference, that because shatter's been around a lot longer, it's kind of like yesterday's news, right? I've been smoking shatter for 20 years, right? So when new products like live resin come around and live rosin, there might be less familiarity because they're newer, but the preference is higher because of the novelty, right? There's a new form factor. There's something new and cool that everyone's chatting
about. There's a trendiness aspect to it.
Exactly. And I think that's the correlation that maybe we're seeing here between familiarity and preference.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that too, that's why we find it so helpful to sort of keep our finger on the pulse as trends develop and continue to go in and talk to consumers at regular intervals. Every 2 weeks, we survey consumers through our Green Time cannabis community. I just want to call out another comment here from a LinkedIn user, anonymous comment. Love that. Hash was definitely a concentrate I tried early on in my consumption days from my uncle, who had some insane stuff. It still holds a special place in my heart. Smiley face. Love that. Thank you for the comment.
There's another.
There's a lot of us that were. I mean, I'm a little bit. I'll tell my age a little bit here, but I was smoking hash in the 80s, right? And there's people smoking in the 70s and the 60s. Obviously, hash has been around for centuries, as I think we know, right? And in America and popular culture, it's been around for for decades, if not a century or more, right? So hash has been around a really, really long time. And I think these latest innovations in extracts and how you make concentrate concentrates and solvents and all these various things that we've been talking about. That's what brings all these different splinters that we're seeing of just really new and interesting form factors. At the end of the day, they're derivatives of ancient hash making. They're just using techniques and technologies.
And that actually was a comment from Sarah Falvo. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Not sure why it came up as just LinkedIn user, but thank you for your comment.
Hey, Sarah from ArcView.
Oh, and it looks like we have a question from David. Can we ask Claudio what his favorite extract is to produce and why at Guild Extracts? Good question.
Interesting. Well, truth be told, for me, we make a live resin cartridge, actually. So me being someone, I'm on the go a lot, and I like the convenience of it. And we talked about the backpack dabber. We also talked about the Puffco Peak and why that became so popular, because you take the whole instrumentation around dabbing and you create a more frictionless form of consumption. And I think that's why Puffco is so popular, among other reasons, is that it's a portable, dabbing device, which is awesome. But then you get a cartridge, which is even the most portable, right? It's the easiest to use. Now, a lot of the purists will say, no, like dabbing is really the ritual around that. And so people are like, why is Claudio saying that as someone at Guild Extracts? But look, at the end of the day, I'm just saying in terms of most commonly, I love our Guild Extracts live resin cartridges. We call it our full spectrum cartridge, because you're basically getting something that's equivalent of just the purest live resin, a high terpene extract. We put it in a cartridge, unlike other cartridges that, again, can have cutting agents and dilutants and distillate and all sorts of other ingredients in there. Ours is just 100% pure cannabis and terpenes, nothing added. And just whenever I kind of hit that cartridge, it's just the flavor of it and everything. It's just so convenient for me. I'm just a kind of a busy person, and also I have to admit
the pocket dabber, David.
Yeah, exactly. It's pocket dabbing. Well, and also truth be told is that it's just the potency, right? Too, even though the potency kind of on the label is that it's very potent, the reality is that when you're hitting a cartridge, you're not inhaling as much as you do like a huge dab. And so for me, taking really huge dabs, that's something that I do on a more rare occasion, because that's when I have to lean back. I know there's probably here people in the audience and that are dabbers that do it in the morning and they start their day and off they go. That's not me. If I do a huge dab, it's like game over. I'm leaning into my couch and I better have like a good show to watch or a good music to listen to. So it's not functional for me, in other words. So I tend to lean toward the more functional use cases that we aim for at Guild Extracts, and the cartridge is one of them. And there's others, but that's one I'll spotlight.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, and love talking about usage occasions too. I think that adds so much color and context to these stats that we're talking about every week. We have about 4 minutes left, so I don't think we're going to have time to get to our other stats, but that's okay, because we'll bring them back and we'll share them another time. And I just want to say thank you so much to Claudio of Guild Extracts for joining us. This has been such a fun conversation, and we'll have to bring you back on so we can dig into more of these stats.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things to talk about, continue to talk about around rituals, in particular rituals and need states and all of that relative to dabbers and concentrates, because it truly is a unique experience and a very specific, like you said, a certain mind state. You sit down, you've got your kit in front of you. It really is time to geek out, so to speak. Definitely.
And I think that's something that we should never forget, that cannabis does have a very an incredible ritual surrounding it that is historic, right? There's a cultural kind of ritual and significance to it, and that's why people that smoke flower and that want to roll roll their own joint and go through that ritual of smoking it and sharing it. That, in other words, that cannabis can be very just utilitarian. It can have its utility. You can consume it very quickly. Has its efficacy. You're trying to solve very specific use cases, medical or recreational, and that's great. That's one whole end of the market. But the other end is around the culture of connoisseurship and the ritual around it. And dabbing is one of those segments of the kind of cannabis culture and the kind of the dispensary shelf where that really tends to happen, I think, most vibrantly, as well as around flower. And I think we can't forget that. And I think as we move along in the future, you're going to see that culture of connoisseurship, I think, develop more and more. And that's super exciting. And like it, we've seen it with wine. Yep.
Right. And we definitely, we don't have as much time as we thought to get into some of the conversation around appellation, but we would love to have you back and talk about that another time, because I think some of the things that are taking place around appellations and regional brands and or cultivation is another trend that's taking place right now that that I'm sure you have a lot to say on as well.
Yeah, no, that's another exciting development that we'll see that will add yet another layer of sophistication and nuance, that it's not just what you're tasting, but then is getting that sense of origin and typicity and terroir that is coming very quickly in cannabis that you have in the wine industry again. And so I'm really excited for that day as well, because it's just going to get more and more layered and nuanced and sophisticated. And I think the best is ahead of us in terms of the rabbit hole that we can go down in consuming cannabis and really bringing out that ritual and that connoisseurship that we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's exciting. And it's always exciting
Absolutely.
to hear an industry veteran say, you know, the best is still ahead of us. And that's always exciting.
Yep.
Adriana, any comments before we start to close out the show? I do know.
Yeah.
Yes, we have a couple more questions for Claudio as well. Claudio, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, yeah, we're gonna put his info up here so you can learn more about these products that we've been talking about today. And in the last 30 seconds, friendly reminder for our viewers: if you haven't signed up for CANNAfact Friday, the newsletter, please do. You'll get a weekly stat delivered right into your inbox, and then you can jump on and listen to us give some context at 10 a.m. every Friday. And thank you for joining us. And yeah, so. This is great. This has been a fun one.
Yeah. So again, just want to thank everybody. First off, Claudio, for participating and sharing and clarifying a lot of things that even I had, a 12-year veteran, lost between resin, rosin, live, not live. So that was really helpful for us. We are here every Friday, as we said earlier, to talk through some of the questions that baffle us in the industry, and to speak with folks like you, Claudio, to help us make the most of what we do and to better understand our industry from week to week. We're excited. I'll close out the show by saying next week's guest is Marco Hoffman. Marco Hoffman was the founder of Venice Cookie Company in California, founder of Evergreen Herbal up here in Washington State. We'll be chatting with him about form factors, and we'll cross over everything from edibles all the way through to beverages. And Marco's got some great insight, some great knowledge, and some great history outside of the cannabis industry that really makes him a special person within the industry as well. I think that's pretty much it. We survived another week here. We did. Thank you. And that said, we'll be back next Friday at 10 a.m. Every Friday, 10 a.m. PST and 1 p.m. EST for our friends on the East Coast. We'll have more big data energy for you next week. And I'll just leave with thank you, everybody, and thank God it's CANNAfact Friday.
Yes, thank you guys.
Well said.
Appreciate it. Super fun.
Bye, everybody.
Be well. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.